We've covered already many issues in terms of international finance and how it's done, international project finance mostly. We also talked a lot about the global economic conditions, the global economic environment today, which affects really heavily, really deeply all global economic events in investment, in global investment, in foreign direct investment, and many other issues. In particular, globalization, financial globalization, the things which are unthinkable without global connections, global communication, without network economy. It seems like the world has become a little bit senseless with closed border policies. Without open border policies, the globalization is obsolete. We do not have to communicate, or it is really difficult to communicate. Well, actually, what we are going to deal with today is a little bit talking about international expertise, experience of many countries, many companies in the world of foreign direct investment, project finance deals, and how it's done by companies, in particular most important countries, because like we said, most of the time project finance deals are usually done by many companies and countries combined. So it is impossible to imagine projects such as hydropower stations or nuclear power stations conducted and done by single companies and single banks. This is just impossible. Here we can see various projects, examples of project finance deals mostly conducted in the world of finance. In terms of telecommunications, oil and gas exploration, infrastructure, of course, transportation, and many industrial goods and services. These projects appear in today's economies mostly in countries that are mostly in need of those investments and infrastructure projects. What are those nations? What are those countries? It seems like the advanced countries of this world do not require most of these things because they already have them. Unfortunately, this is not always the case. Global warming problems and global climate change has showed that the situation in many countries, advanced countries, where the seaports and river ports and other port infrastructure is very, very vulnerable, because it was built in the 1960s or in the 1950s even. In the United States, for example, there are ports in Milwaukee or somewhere in the region of Great Lakes. We've got the Americans got infrastructure from the 1950s and 1960s. So it is really vulnerable to climate change and increasing levels of water in the rivers, in the Great Lakes, in the oceans, in the world ocean. So it's a very serious issue. And of course, seaports are very important in global transportation networks, because seaports, maritime ports such as Amsterdam or Rotterdam, Naples, San Francisco, of course, and other seaports across the globe, somewhere in Asia, Osaka, Yokohama, cities such as these, they experience today this huge wave of climate change, and they are threatened by global warming and increasing level of the ocean, and especially because those infrastructure projects, those ports were built in the 1960s, they are extremely vulnerable, because any change, any drastic storm, and we've got lots of them, Katrinas and other kinds of storms, which bear very interesting names, human names sometimes. Although they sound humane, they are not, of course, human at all. This is a very disastrous and devastating force that may destroy whole cities, whole states, and kill thousands of people, even hundreds of thousands of people. In 2004, during a great tsunami in India and Bangladesh, 300,000 people died due to floods and tsunami just on 2 days of those typhoons. That was an absolutely disastrous thing. Of course, people try to settle today far from sea coast, so people got used to things such as these. But still, infrastructure and seaports, container ships, and we require those transportation networks. They are, we cannot imagine the world of transportation without great seaports. So, in the industrial countries, in the advanced countries of this world, we need restructuring processes. We need restructure projects. We need investment in restoration facilities. That means we also got to invest in maintenance, in restoration, in restoring, rebuilding, up to date with modern technologies, because things change a lot since the global transportation networks have been built somewhere in the 1950s, 60s and 70s. Lots of lots of times passed by, so we got to think about that as well. We also got to think about infrastructure facilities such as nuclear power plants and many other hydroelectric power plants, because also in the industrial countries, in the advanced countries, although they are rich countries, they've got facilities that date back to the 1960s again, 70s and 80s. So they're also vulnerable to many things in this world of ours. Germany, as is known, is a country very sensitive to nuclear power, because this country experienced such situations and environmental catastrophes such as, for example, Chernobyl in 1986. This was an event, a technological disaster that happened. That was a very disastrous event which happened in the Soviet Union. And first, the Soviet Union and the policymakers, politicians in the Soviet Union tried to calm things down. They did not talk about that openly, but very soon it became evident that this nuclear power station really collapsed. There was an explosion, and all that stuff was blown away all the way to Germany, Finland, and larger parts of Russia, Belarus, and the Ukraine. So that was an absolutely disastrous catastrophe. Of course, people did lots of efforts in order to contain that disaster, but still the effect was drastic. And since then, Germany started to fear nuclear power plants and those investment projects in the country. They also had very good projects. They wanted an independent nuclear energy system. They started building this system in 1955, when Germany became completely independent, because 10 years passed after the end of World War II, and Germany regained its independence from the Allied troops from the United States, Britain, and France. These occupation armies went home, and only some groups of military force remained. And still today, they've got in Germany military bases of the United States with over 50,000 people, and 36,000 military men, soldiers that is, and 12,000 more civilians who support them. But Donald Trump decided to withdraw at least 15,000 people from Germany, because he thinks that Germany does not comply to the NATO rules. They do not want to increase investment in military infrastructure. They do not want the share of GDP to be increased by 2 or 3% a year, so that they supported those military infrastructure. And Trump said that the United States is not going to pay for the security in Europe, in Germany in particular, and if something happens, if Russia strikes, we will not come to help you. Well, maybe that's all political propaganda, but the thing is that all those infrastructure projects and investment facilities built in Germany are also they also require maintenance, restructure, redevelopment, restoration, because they were built in the 1950s, 60s, and that means they're very old, and this increases the probability of some catastrophe. Also, in Russia, we had such catastrophes. For example, Sayano-Shushensk hydroelectric power station also collapsed a couple of years ago. That was a huge disaster. Billions of rubles were spent in order to contain that disaster. And that was the largest hydroelectric power station in the world to date. Of course, things change. Like I said, China built also a hydroelectric power station that today considers the biggest in the world. So China is a very strong industrial power in these terms, and they build lots of infrastructure facilities in their country, especially energy grids, because this is the nation of 1.5 billion people, and this nation of 1.5 billion people require electricity. There were speculations in the media in the 1990s, in the 2000s, asking what happens if every Chinese switches on the light. What happens? That means they will require at least 1.5 billion lamps, and this is a very huge amount of power that is needed to supply that economy. Also, the industry is growing, and that means they also require more electricity, and also they are very concerned about brownouts and blackouts, because if they happen, the production process disrupts, and that causes huge costs and other negative consequences. In the emerging countries, these facilities, if they were built, they were built also in the 1960s and 70s, and that means they also require some kind of reconstruction, redevelopments, but also many countries in East Asia, in Africa, in Latin America do not have any facilities of such sort at all, because they got won independence from colonial metropoly countries in the 1960s, and they did not start really great infrastructure projects in those days, so they had to wait some time. Ethiopia, for example, started to build an electric hydropower station and a river dam on the Nile 60 years ago. So it took 60 years for this country to build its first hydroelectric power station, and they built it only due to Chinese investments. So Chinese came there and they started this great infrastructure project. They acquired all bonds that were sold to the public in order to accumulate funds, and people got their money after 60 years of fraud, of political speculations, political campaigning, political propaganda. So the government did nothing in order to supply the country with electricity, in order to make that infrastructure project happen, and so lots of things happened since then, and it was only China Development Bank and other companies that went there and built that infrastructure facility. So across the emerging world, they really badly in need of those infrastructure facilities. Of course, transportation networks. Transportation is a very important factor in the development of any country in the world, especially highways, railways. Goods and goods are usually transported via roads, railroads, so they need those networks. China started its very famous Belt and Road Initiative in 2013. President Xi Jinping announced these ambitious projects, and today cities that never had any connection to other large cities in China and the region, the Asian region, were connected. High-speed railways, high-speed networks became the communicating point in order to facilitate the flows of goods, especially of manufactured goods. Thousands of kilometers from Beijing, the city of Urumqi, for example, which lies far away in the western region of China, in the far west of China, wild west of China. So, like in the US history, the United States tried to rediscover the Wild West in the 1920s and the 1930s. They built infrastructure there. They wanted to increase the level of development in the Wild West of the United States in the 1920s and 30s, so that the country would be more evenly developed, more evenly industrialized. So they started building railroads and highways. The same thing happens today in China in the 21st century, 100 years on after the US industrialization. China started its own industrialization, and they built these great transportation networks also. Today, to go from Beijing to Xinjiang in the far western region of China, it takes only 4 hours. That means 2,500 kilometers. This is a huge amount of. This is a huge distance, 2,500 kilometers, and it takes only 4 hours to get there. So it's absolutely impressive. In Russia, we do not have mostly such facilities, but for the railroads connecting St. Petersburg and Moscow. And this is only 700 kilometers or so. And it takes, to go from St. Petersburg to Moscow, or from Moscow to St. Petersburg, it takes 3.5 hours or 4 hours, but this is 700 kilometers. And in China, to go from Beijing to Xinjiang, it's 2,500 kilometers. It takes 4 hours also. So that's absolutely impressive. 20 years ago, it took you 40 hours to get there. So the progress is happening very, very drastically, very strongly in China these days. And in other countries also, they've got projects running with high-speed networks, internet connections as well. Today, the countries of the world are thinking about building mobile networks of the 5th generation, 5G networks. The European Union, Australia, Japan, the United States, Great Britain, they are thinking about constructing 5G networks, because they think that if they do not do this, they're going to suffer huge costs in the future. They're going to suffer this slow growth, and they need more productivity. They require more production facilities to be connected by these 5G networks. So they need speed, they need more people to work on those 5G networks. And they wanted Chinese company, Chinese giant, telecoms giant Huawei, to construct those facilities in Europe, in the US, in Japan, in Australia. Unfortunately, the policies of the United States and the European Union lead to global sanctions against Chinese giants, especially this company Huawei. They think that Huawei is going to spy on the United States. They're going to participate in espionage activities in the United States. They're going to steal intellectual property from the United States, and actually they're going to listen to everything their politicians say in the CIA, at the Pentagon, well, what Donald Trump says, or Joe Biden if he ends up in the Oval Office in January. So many things happen there due to this wave of international sanctions. Actually, international sanctions today come as a sort of a political direction, political presumption or assumption that is used in order to impact various countries of this world, in order to impose your will upon those countries. The United States is very disappointed with what China is doing, because they in the United States think that they helped a lot China to go from the slums and to raise this country from the disasters of World War II, from the disasters of the communist regime, of that cultural revolution in China. And they think that the United States, of course, helped a lot. They invested billions, hundreds of billions of dollars into this economy and the Greater China, as well as they supported always the International Financial Center in Hong Kong. And this International Financial Center maintains $10 trillion of transactions going through this one single international financial center. They settle $10 trillion worth international contracts, derivatives, and financial and other financial activities. So this is going to be a huge blow, especially when China issued a new law in order to make Hong Kong its territory completely and tear away all those democratic rights and democratic ideas about this country, like they say. Of course, many things have been made up, and many things were exaggerated about Chinese policies on Hong Kong. But still, this is the new reality, and we will have to live in this new reality. Russia also faces international sanctions. For over 6 years, we hear nothing but sanctions. This topic has become one of the most important media topics in the world. Each and every newspaper writes about sanctions every day and every week. The United States, either it's the United States or the European Union, Australia, Japan, they're thinking about new sanctions. They prohibit some politicians. They declare them persona non grata. They cannot come to the United States, or they want to arrest some assets of those billionaires in Russia or in the United States. So they think that this is the way to press upon, like they say, totalitarian regimes, authoritarian regimes in Russia, in Belarus, in China in order to make or to push through their decisions in order to suppress those countries in their development, in order to maintain their position in the world economy like it used to be. And we know that this Navalny situation, the story about Navalny, his poisoning, may lead to drastic economic situation in Russia, because they want to sanction Nord Stream 2 project. And Nord Stream 2 is also one of the greatest and one of the largest international finance project deals in the recent years. Nord Stream 2 is taking Russian gas to Germany and the European Union. Russia supplies 33% of all gas supplies to of the European Union. Now, this is a huge amount of gas and a huge amount of hard currency that each year comes to Russia in the form of the euros or US dollars. This is hard currency. We exchange that and we store that in our gold reserves, in foreign exchange reserves. And today, like you know, Russian foreign exchange reserves reached an absolutely historic maximum of almost $600 billion. This is a very great amount of money. We've got lots of gold at the central bank. Also, we profited lots in terms of gold appreciation recently on the stock markets, in the gold exchanges, in the ETFs and things such as these. The price of gold reached also an all-time high of almost $2,000 an ounce of gold. I think you remember that in 1944, when the Bretton Woods system was established, the price of gold was $35 an ounce of gold. Today it's $2,000. So gold is not a currency, but it is a very good investment asset, which is known to be a safe haven asset. Many countries, including Russia, China, Japan, Germany, mostly exporting nations, of course, they exchange the currency they receive, they exchange it for gold and deposit it in their central banks. And this is a very good and solid hedge against vulnerabilities, against natural catastrophes and things such as these. Each and every project SPV, like we said, requires lots of people, lots of companies participating in it. In order to create a project, in order to construct something, to build some facilities in any country, we need, of course, to buy a special purpose vehicle company. We also were talking about this special purpose vehicle company, and it is being set up usually in an offshore zone due to lower taxes and very good investment climate, very favorable investment climate in countries such as Cyprus or Malta, Virginian Islands, Mauritius. Great Britain, of course, is not an offshore zone country, but the level of taxation and other investment climate capacities there are very, very favorable. And many companies also go to Great Britain and they set up their headquarters there, they set up subsidiaries in order to deal with other companies. And of course, Great Britain and the city of London is a treasure of professionals skilled in many financial services. They are very, very clever about doing financial business operations. They're very good accountants, they're very good auditors, very respectful, and very, very experienced. All those household names, benchmarks, which we know today, the Lloyds, Standard Chartered, HSBC, Banking Corporation, and other great powerhouses of the financial world in the London city, well, they actually are very professional in providing help and financial assistance to countries, to many companies in the world. And also London Stock Exchange is a very good platform, is a very good venue in order to deal in the shares, in order to trade in some stocks. They've got lots of opportunities of IPOs or initial public offerings. Today, many companies in the world, in China, in Russia, and other growing nations, rapidly developing countries, they require these financial instruments, financial facilities, such as London Stock Exchange. Aramco, the largest oil company in the world, also wanted an IPO. They decided, King Abdullah decided to push through this project. First, at the El Riyadh Stock Exchange, they wanted to accumulate something like $2 trillion in these initial public offering, and they wanted to use that as a platform in order to go to developed markets in the United States, New York Stock Exchange, of course, and London Stock Exchange. They also wanted to make IPOs there. Unfortunately, some of their fortunes really darkened when this coronavirus thing started in the world, and many bright hopes of this country really darkened. The oil industry, which was the driving, which used to be the driving force of many countries, especially the Gulf nations, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, United Emirates, United Arab Emirates, Saudi Arabia, Oman, Iran, Iraq. So they're all dependent on oil exploration. Russia is very dependent on oil exploration and oil supplies to the Western countries. And each and every vulnerability in the price of this crude benchmark really affects these countries, because they've got huge government spending covered by windfall prices in the oil markets. But like we know, oil prices collapsed, and some of these oil-bearing nations, OPEC countries, really came to the brink of economic and financial disaster. especially the government, which is a very important party in project SPV deals. It is very important because government provides guarantees. So no international project finance deal happens without government support, without government guarantee. Government has special instruments. Usually those instruments are called government bonds. So government bonds are being sold on the market, and these government bonds bring benefits. They bring fixed revenues. Fixed revenue or fixed coupon yields on each of those government bonds is a very good investment in this world of ours. Government bonds and corporate bonds also of very good and solid companies such as IBM, Microsoft, Apple, and other great household names, brand companies. Their bonds are very good in dealing with the stock markets in London, in New York. So they're very, very heavy in demand because these companies are very huge profiteers from the Industrial Revolution in emerging countries, in advanced countries. They are also very good at doing some infrastructure projects. They have taken advantage of prosperity in the recent years. During the early 2000s, there was a huge boom in internet companies and other high-tech companies. So we've got a group of companies and a club of countries with good and solid government bonds, which are a good asset in order to support project finance deals. Each and every block of these operations really helps to make things happen in project finance deal. So each and every party, in terms of loans, in terms of banking assets, in terms of government support and guarantees, each of these blocks is very important in order to create, in order to make this project finance deal. We've got several types of project finance and actually finance activities of the government, of the public, corporate finance, and of course they have some sort of features, some sort of activities and very specific strengths, very specific organization. When we're talking about public finance, government is the sole administrator in these deals. The government supplies these public finance deals with funds, and the government puts some collateral, and this is the guarantee, which usually helps in these sort of activities. It is wholly controlled by the government, so no influence is allowed, no pressure is being done. Of course, government may turn to banks, because governments produce money, of course, through to central banks usually. Also, governments have their own commercial banks. They've got central bank assets, so they may use them. But most of the time, they also require loans from commercial banks, from consortiums of banks, and they provide guarantees in the form of government bonds, and thus government also has revenue in terms of taxes and in terms of other profits from government corporations, state-owned enterprises. Thus, this money is being collected and put into operation. And public finance leads to the construction of railroads, also some other facilities, infrastructure facilities, dams, river dams. They build seaports this way. So it is very, very similar to the process of making international finance, project finance deals. The distinction would be here that no SPV is organized. There is no SPV, and all is done by some government authority. They give government order, they auction a tender, and the company which is very good, which is very skilled at doing something, is given the permission to build an infrastructure project. And usually those companies are granted those projects that may supply the final results at the lowest price possible. Or this is also a general practice in Russia, for instance. They give grants to foreign companies because in Russia, for example, we're always thinking about attracting some foreign investors and foreign high-tech and other know-how from the advanced countries, and we think that that will help modernize our economy, and this is a good idea this way. So they give grants and other permissions to these sorts of companies. And also we've got corporate finance. This is usually private investors. He also may deal with infrastructure projects. They do this themselves because, for example, in 1998, Ford Motor Company came to Russia and set up a subsidiary somewhere in Vyborg, close to St. Petersburg. They started a facility there. They built up a factory and started producing Ford Focus cars, 100,000 cars a year. That was a good investment. It created lots of jobs, and it was also a project finance deal that involved company resources, corporate finance, because Ford Motor Company has its own financial facility that provides loans to this company at low interest rates, and they're able to build factories not only in Russia but across the globe, because this is a very good idea of theirs to create a special facility, financial fund, so to speak, that supplies this corporation with money at low interest rates, and they're able to expand their networks and to expand their factory bases in many countries of the world, in China, in India, in Japan, of course in the United States. They also use these financial facilities in order to accelerate, in order to help the distribution of their cars. Because in the United States in particular, they use these sorts of corporate facilities and funding operations in order to lend money to people who would like to buy a car. And they make loans to those people, and people do not have to turn to banks like in Russia in order to buy something. We always go to banks for loans. In the United States, to buy a car, you do not need to go to a bank. You just go to Ford Motor Company, you buy a Ford, for instance, and they provide you with this financial facility, with a loan, a very maybe sometimes even interest-free loans, and you buy a car and drive it the same day you receive this car. So this was a very good idea in the United States. It helped many companies in the United States to grow and expand, not only in the country but outside it as well. And of course, project finance. The difference from corporate finance and public finance is that here we've got all those, the same parties actually, right? We've got corporations, banks, governments also involved. But here the distinction is we got a project finance company, which is called an SPV, and it is at the heart of all those operations. And this heart brings together all those parties: lenders, banks, sponsors, governments, corporations, professionals skilled in finance, accounting, audit, financial statements, and many other things. And of course, we've got users or off-takers of this project, and we've got initial suppliers who supply this project company with resources, raw materials, and in a couple of years' time, when this project is finished, we have off-takers who use those results. They take away electricity, and this plant goes into operation. A very important thing here to talk about is that usually these project finance deals are very long term. They cannot be done short term. Short-term facilities are built only in order to get profited. And we also do have examples such as these in the international finance. For instance, Russian companies, some Russian companies called developers. Developers, actually, this is a usual name for construction companies who do not construct anything. But they organize the construction process, or they just buy some facility under construction in the United States or somewhere in Europe, in Florida, for instance, in the state of Florida. They buy unfinished construction facilities, unfinished hotels, unfinished railroads, buildings, unfinished seaports. They organize the construction process, they finish the construction, and sell these hotels, these facilities at higher prices, of course. And usually they gain 35 or even 40 times as much money as they invested in the first place. And these investments are very good assets, so to speak, in international finance, and they're very short term. They're less risky and very convenient to do. The things which we are talking about, international project finance deals, are much more long term in the process. They require 3, 5, sometimes 10 years in order to build a single plant, a single power plant, nuclear power plant. It is very difficult because first you got to set up a corporation, which is called an SPV. You got to find investors, sponsors, banks. You got to get permissions from the government in order to rent the land where you're going to construct this factory or a power plant. And it takes bribes. It takes years to get those permissions in the emerging countries. It gets huge paperwork. So that means you got to have people very skilled in the paperwork and these red tape activities. So it consumes lots of money, and this money gets just wasted. It's a waste of time and waste of money. In the first 3 to 5 years, your project does not bring any profit to the people involved. That means all those loans, all those sponsor funds go into this sort of hole, and they get consumed there and burned, actually, with no profits received. This is where we need government guarantees. So if government steps in and provides guarantees, investors, banks, loan givers stay with this project. They wait for a couple of years more, for 3, 4, or 5 years, they stay in the project, and as soon as this construction facility, as soon as this power plant is finished and consumers buy its results, off-takers consume electricity or something else, depending on the project. This investment company, this SPV, gets profited, and this revenue is used in order to repay the loans to banks, to sponsors, to investors, shareholders, stockholders of this great project. So it takes lots of time, lots of patience, lots of paperwork, and this is not an easily done thing. That's why an SPV is always created in countries with very low tax regime, even sometimes with no taxes. In other countries that would be a disaster, because we've got many risks. We've got financial risks, we've got currency risks, foreign exchange risks, because this is also a very important thing, a currency exchange risk, foreign exchange risk. We live in the world of financial turbulence, and each day currencies fluctuate, they devalue, or they appreciate or depreciate, and this increases the financial risks for SPV projects. Ruble depreciated to the US dollar in a couple of weeks by some 10 or 15%. And that means if you invest something in Russia, your investments are also going to suffer with this depreciation. Of course, you may provide loans in US dollars. That would be much more convenient for investors. If government issues euro bonds, in euros or US dollars. But for people involved in the project, who are the intermediate, who are the immediate participants of this project, they're going to suffer the most. Because if ruble depreciates, they will have to pay more. They will have to collect more taxes, they will have to collect more revenue from their facilities, from their projects. They will have to find somewhere money in order to repay those dividends and those loans, because nobody is going to give their money for free. Money is a very precious thing. It is very limited in time. It is very vulnerable to financial tsunami, to financial vulnerabilities and fluctuations in the financial international financial centers and things such as these. We also got a number of instruments in order to assess, of course, investment projects, and we may use for that various formulas, which sometimes are very useful in order to calculate the actual amount of money needed, the actual amount of risk involved, the actual amount of profit being taken, and income received, and other such things. We need those ratios in order to calculate the final result, because well, in this world of ours, we always deal with some other investment opportunities, and if we think that this investment project is very, very profitable, then we stay. If we've got other options and we think that other projects in other countries are going to bring us more, we withdraw from the contract and go to other countries and invest our money in those countries and help them build their infrastructure facilities, nuclear power plants, electricity grids, etc. So you've got a number of very interesting ratios in order to assess the profitability of the project. Usually these ratios are used by an SPV that was created. They usually organize news, press conferences and presentations, and during those presentations they explain to all the parties involved the process and the proceedings, financial statements. They declare openly and freely. They provide transparent information on what the company is doing, how it's doing, how it's making, whether it's doing really well in its operations, and if investors are satisfied with the result, they stay with the project. If not, they begin to be very nervous, because investments are very nervous. They are very sensitive to changes in interest rates, in growth rates, in forecasts. For example, today, when forecasts change each day some kind of data are published in terms of GDP growth, GDP projections, inflation projections, interest rates. So no one is sure these days about anything. Everything changes really dramatically and very quickly, and that means also we've got this very difficult communication problem. we do not have many possibilities and many facilities we used to have. In this way, internet companies and other web conference providers benefited, like Zoom or Microsoft Teams. They all profited from those web conferencing ideas and web applications. This is also a part of costs for our international project finance deals, because we got to pay for that, to bring whole countries and lenders, banks, governments into this communication process in order to decide to organize a meeting. This is very difficult and very absolutely important in these sorts of things, where they make those presentations with all those ratios and assessments. We're not going, of course, to stipulate and to define all those ratios. I'm sure you know some of them at least, and sometimes I think you even use them for your own calculations. Maybe even you use them at your work for similar calculations in order to understand the return on equity or some profit margin on sales and things such as these. So they are very generally used in companies and corporations in order to assess investments. They are very useful sorts of data to be created, to be supplied to investors, lenders, and other people involved in international project finance. NPV is also a very famous concept, very famous formula, net present value. So in order to understand the future margins, you got to calculate the net present value of your project, facilities, what you expect. You use discount rates. You got to keep in mind interest rates, loan rates, and many other things also, in order to understand what this project is going to bring in the future. It's like any asset is an asset only then when it brings profit in the future. If there are projections about negative returns on investment, that means this project is going to fail, and nobody is going to get their money back. Nobody is going to get their investments back, dividends, loans, or interests on those loans. A very special topic to talk about in the investment in international project finance deals is, of course, banks' participation. I think this is the most important aspect of international project finance deals. Banks are actually the providers of investments, of loans, and other financial resources for our purposes. And they are the major intermediary in this process. We've got a number of banks that usually support investment projects in emerging countries. We've got non-profit organizations, non-profit banks, and of course commercial banks. The banks and organizations listed here such as International Bank for Reconstruction and Development, Asian Development Bank, European Bank for Reconstruction and Development, International Financial Cooperation, International Development Association, and other agencies included in the United Nations organization and included in the World Bank Group, which was created after World War II. These banks are non-profit, and their single purpose is to help the reconstruction and development in the emerging countries. At first, these banks had a special purpose. They had a special goal to supply help, to supply technical assistance and loans to countries damaged during the World War II. And these countries were mostly the European countries, because they were devastated really after World War II. France, Germany, Great Britain, Russia, the Soviet Union, I mean, Japan, China, they all needed those loans. Mostly, first of all, and for the foremost target, the foremost goal of those non-profit organizations. Actually, there were not so many at the start. There was only the International Bank for Reconstruction and Development. It was only later that the International Financial Cooperation was created, International Development Agency. We're talking about 1960s. They were created in the 1960s and 70s. So really some 20, 30 years after the creation of the first foundation of the international financial architecture at the Bretton Woods Conference. They work really on the non-profit basis. They are not interested in interest. Yeah, they're not interested in profit, although they got to work somehow. They will have to pay at least wages to the staff at the World Bank or at the IMF. But actually, they were created in order to stabilize current account deficits, to stabilize national currencies. If they went out of hand during financial crisis, during currency crisis or industrial crisis, and there were many of those crises after World War II. Of course, some countries experienced economic miracles, because that was the period of huge investment projects in Germany, in Japan, and other European countries. In the United States also there was a boom in economic activity after World War II, because the United States supplied money to the rest of the world, technology, and they got profited. They benefited a lot from the expansion of transnational cooperation. They dominated the financial system of this world of ours. In the 1960s and the 1970s, that was the period, the golden age of American corporations. In the 1990s, when the Soviet Union collapsed and bipolar world became one polar world with US dominance, the globalization took hold of the world, and all countries in the world got involved in this capitalistic idea that that prosperity could be created through loans, through money given by international organizations, through technology given by transnational corporations from the United States, Japan, Europe, and they really embraced this wave of mergers and acquisitions in their countries. They also invited project finance companies to their countries, and they were really happy about that at first. Later on, when they understood that this is not going to be, that nothing comes without a price, and you got to pay for those investments, for those loans, to the international organizations, to the IMF and the World Bank. So you really had to think about that you will have to repay those loans and investments back someday, or future generations will be responsible for that also. So that was a very interesting period. The United States really felt like a superpower, like a juggernaut in the global economy. It was a hegemon. The United States in the 1990s was the sole hegemon in the world. And especially today it is clear when countries such as China, the European Union, are getting stronger and more powerful in economic relations. They've got their own financial facilities that provide capital, that provide investments to the rest of the world. So the United States feels really pressed upon by those activities, and they do not want to, of course, they do not want to leave their place really peacefully without of their own will. They're not going to do that, of course. The US dollar is still the world reserve currency, and they really benefit from that because loans are provided mostly in US dollars in the world. Of course, loans can be provided in euros, but usually countries in the world get loans in US dollars. They also issue their own bonds, international bonds, and circulate them, put them into circulation at the international stock exchanges, and they use US dollars as well. So US dollar is by far the largest, the greatest and most important currency in the world. And when China started its ideas and its proposals about more UN participation in the international monetary system, the United States was really deeply impressed by that, and they started thinking about what should they do in order to delay that rise of China, and in order to maintain the position of the United States in the world financial architecture, world monetary system. And they discovered this way of international sanctions. I started this lecture with the idea of international sanctions being implemented by countries of the West in order to make the growth of these countries, emerging countries, a little bit slower, in order not to let them dominate the world financial system, the world monetary system, in order to keep the old world as it used to be in the 1940s and the 1950s after World War II. They want to save this world order that was created back then.